The CIEL report they cannot ignore, and the Ecocide law coming for geoengineering. CIEL's geoengineering briefing, Stop Ecocide's legal framework, and what both institutions are still catching up on. In late 2024, a significant institution arrived at the conclusion that independent researchers, ecologists, and citizen scientists have been documenting for decades. The Centre for International Environmental Law published the first comprehensive public scientific briefing on geoengineering's real-world risks. Today, the 18th of June, Stop Ecocide International, through legal advisor Anna Faye Maddrick, outlined a credible criminal law framework capable of holding geoengineers accountable. Both documents are significant and both are long overdue. Not through any failure of their part, but because this issue has been dismissed as a conspiracy for so long, while the environmental and health damage it causes has continued unabated, obstructing the progress of environmental lawyers and ecocide legislation. One of them, however, opens with a framing problem that must be addressed before anything else can move forward. Maddrick writes that not long ago, manipulating the planetary systems that regulate life on Earth were largely the domain of science fiction. Today, she says, it is the subject of serious policy debate. The sentence is legally precise and well-intentioned. It is also factually wrong in a way that matters enormously for what comes after. Geoengineering did not recently cross from science fiction into policy debate. Outdoor atmospheric experiments have been running since the early 1970s. The Henrik Boll Foundation and ETC's group Geoengineering Map records at least 598 proposed field trials since 1971. The CIEL report itself acknowledges this timeline. So the framing that treats geoengineering as an emerging technology approaching deployment is not caution. It is, whether intentionally or not, a form of cover. It absorbs 50 years or more of unassessed. All experiments are legally bound to undergo environmental risk and impact assessments, and geoengineering experiments have conveniently bypassed, as if they operate above the law, consented atmospheric experimentation into a narrative of responsible innovation that never happened. This matters legally. Ecocide law cannot be built on a timeline that begins in the present. The damage has a history, the funders have names. The chemical signatures are already in the soil, the air, and the water, the organisms. The crime did not begin when institutions started paying attention to it. That said, the Ecocide law framework is exactly what is needed, and CIEL's evidence is the most credible public documentation of harm that has yet appeared from an internationally recognized body. The critique here is not of their conclusion, it is the starting point, because where you place the beginning of a problem determines who gets held accountable for it and who doesn't. Geoengineering has not recently crossed from science fiction into policy debate. The question that neither document fully confronts is this: if the crime has been in progress since the 1970s, what does accountability look like for 50 years of unassessed, unconsented atmospheric experimentation? That question needs to be the center of any legal strategy and case building, not treated as background context. Here is what the evidence shows across the chemistry, the funding, the ecology, the government failures, and why the moment for institutional frameworks to catch up is already overdue. The myths they're still selling you. CIEL dedicates considerable space to dismantling the justification that geoengineering proponents have cycled through decades. They're worth naming directly. It mimics natural processes. No, volcanic eruptions and natural carbon cycles operate on spatial and temporal scales that are incomparable to those of stratospheric aerosol injection programs. Natural processes are self-limiting. These are not. It buys us time. Time for what exactly? CIEL points out that framing geoengineering as a temporal bridge measure has served primarily to delay the elimination of fossil fuels, not to accelerate it. If the plan is to dim the sun while the industry continues operating at full capacity, the bridge leads nowhere. The known risks of climate change outweigh the unknown risks of geoengineering. CIEL's position: this is not an honest comparison. Geoengineering doesn't neutralize existing climate risks. It layers new, potentially irreversible ones on top of them. It could help biodiversity. The reverse is true. Solar radiation modification, SRM, disrupts food webs, alters precipitation, weakens the ozone layer, and can cause ozone depletion in marine ecosystems. The organisms most sensitive to these shifts are pollinators, amphibians, migratory birds, and insects are already in free fall. There's no government framework yet. There has been a de facto global moratorium on geoengineering under the Convention on Biodiversity since 2010. The London Protocol has set restrictions on marine-based geoengineering activities, and these frameworks exist, but they're being ignored. We need more research before we can say anything definitive. CIEL's response to this is the one I've been giving for nearly a decade. Testing these technologies at the scale required to produce meaningful data would effectively turn the Earth into a full-scale laboratory. In fact, it already has. You cannot run a controlled experiment on a planetary system. Every field test at an operation scale is a deployment. What the data actually shows. So, as stated, according to figures compiled by the Henrik Boll Foundation and the ETC, over 500 geoengineering experiments have been proposed since 1971, though it's possible many more have been deployed. Over 90% of those proposals came between 2004 and 2023. More than half came in the 4 years between 2019 and 2023 alone, 4 times the rate of the preceding 5-year period. Bioenergy with carbon capture, BECCS, and biochar experiments increased 9-fold in the final period. Marine carbon dioxide removal experiments, including ocean alkalinity enhancement and artificial upwelling, increased more than 4-fold. These are not marginal research programs. The scale of proposed and active experiments dwarfs the sanctioned or even consulted by any public or democratic body. What is being sprayed and what are the volumes? Cost analysis suggests that stratospheric aerosol injection programs delivering 1 million tons of sulfate annually would require approximately $1 to $2 billion per year in aircraft-based delivery systems, thousands of flights scaling to 5 million tons, multiplies those costs to 10 billion or more. The funding sources remain largely opaque. What we can say is that a small group of private actors operating under the cover of climate philanthropy are driving the research agenda and, in some cases, the deployment agenda. Who funds it? Who builds it? Who profits? So I actually wrote an article about this in Decoding Geoengineering last year. You can go back to that and click on the link below at the references. The people financing geoengineering research are not anonymous. They are identifiable, their investors are documented, and their interests extend well beyond climate concern. Bill Gates has been a significant backer of geoengineering research through the Fund for Innovative Climate and Energy Research, FISA, with major investments directed at Harvard University's Solar Geoengineering Research Program. Gates holds no scientific background in either health or environment, a detail worth noting given the scale of influence his funding confers on research agendas. He is also a prominent Monsanto investor, a connection that becomes less coincidental when you consider that Monsanto has developed aluminium-resistant seed strains at precisely the moment atmospheric aluminium concentrations are rising in soils globally. George Soros, Jeff Bezos, whose Amazon infrastructure has been used to model geoengineering scenarios, dusting Moscovitz, Sir Richard Branson through his carbon war room charity, tar sands magnate Murray Edwards, and Skype co-founder Niklas Sennström have all directed funding towards solar radiation management research or official reports endorsing it. The preferred funding conduit appears to be Silver Lining, an NGO presenting itself as a safe climate organization. Its donor list include Chris and Crystal Sasha, and its grant flow to the University of Washington, Cornell, Rutgers, and the National Center for Atmospheric Research, among others, Harvard again, and University of Calgary, where geoengineering researcher David Keith manages portions of Gates's funding while running a carbon dioxide removal company, and Stanford have all received significant support through these channels. The financial architecture is deliberately layered: foundations, intermediaries, and named research programs serve to put distance between the oligarchs and the experimental outcome. The companies manufacturing the ingredients are also identifiable. American Elements, led by CEO Michael Silver, who describes himself as an environmental philanthropist, produces the nanoparticles and advanced materials used in atmospheric aerosol applications. BASF, Evonik Industries, DuPont, Albemarle Corporation, Solvay, and Huntsman Corporation all produce chemical compounds relevant to atmospheric modification or cloud seeding programs. What it costs to run a planet-sized laboratory. A 2010 report by Aurora Sciences estimates costs of around 30 billion for large-scale stratospheric aerosol injection. 2018 analysis put initial setup costs for an SAI program at 3.5 billion, with operational costs averaging 2 to 2.5 billion per year over the first 15 years at an injection altitude of 20 kilometers, scaling to 25 kilometers altitude using rocket-assisted delivery pushes. Annual costs are to 71 billion for 1% cooling effect. Why don't you just plant some trees? Enhanced weathering for carbon dioxide removal has been costed at approximately 400 billion per year over 40 years to bring atmospheric CO2 to 350 parts per million. By 2033, the global geoengineering market is projected to reach 133.2 billion, growing at 18.7% annually. That figure is worth sitting with. This is not a research program with uncertain commercial futures. It is an industry with investors, growth projections and profits incentives that depend on the continuation of the problem they claim to be solving. The funding source behind most active programs remain opaque. The financial scale involved bears no relationship to the level of public oversight, democratic consultation, or environmental impact assessments that accompany it. Brief look at the impact of geoengineering ecosystems. The numbers of species declined are not disputed at this point. They are simply disconnected from their cause. Based on the CIEL report, here is what it says about coral reefs and geoengineering damage. Impacts on oceans. Ocean acidification would increase under SRM deployment, since SRM does not reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The long-term consequences on unmitigated ocean acidification include direct and indirect harms to marine organisms' skeleton formation, gas exchange abilities, reproduction, growth, and neural function, with negative consequences for life at all levels of the food chain. More specifically, on coral-enhanced marine microbubbles, a proposed albedo enhancement technology would increase ocean acidification, amplifying its negative effects on marine biodiversity, including harm to corals and shelled species like oysters. Geoengineering is causing oxygen depletion zones where, if SRM deployment and marine cloud brightening increase, especially in the proposed 80-kilometer range of the Antarctic, artificial upwelling contribute to mid-water oxygen depletion events, potentially causing hypoxic damage, which occurs in the absence of sufficient oxygen and inducing mortality in organisms that rely on dissolved oxygen, including various fish, bivalves, and corals, with the greatest impact on larger invertebrate species. The other thing to bear in mind is that these dead oxygen zones are not places which fish will be able to occupy or lay eggs in. More broadly, if bottom-up ocean acidification results from sub-seabed CO2 storage, the resulting ecosystem disruption would have devastating impacts on the entire ocean, including collapsing food webs and reduced oxygen levels, likely leading to hypoxic events. So the report identifies acidification, oxygen depletion, and food web collapse as the primary pathways through which geoengineering specifically threatens marine ecosystems and coral reefs. Geoengineering impact on trade winds. Trade winds are fundamentally driven by temperature differentials between equator and poles, and by atmospheric pressure gradients. Any larger scale geoengineering intervention in the Antarctic that disrupts those temperature relationships would logically trigger significant knock-off effects across global wind circulation patterns. The Center for International Environmental Law has warned that stratospheric aerosol injection alone would reduce the temperature gradient between the equator and the poles, resulting in excess cooling in the tropics and excess warming in the poles, a reversal of the very dynamic that stabilize planetary wind systems. Marine cloud brightening compounds this further by altering the land-sea temperature gradients and shifting mean annual precipitation patterns across both hemispheres. Trade winds do not operate in isolation. They drive ocean currents, regulate rainfall distribution across tropical regions, and govern the upwelling of nutrient-rich waters that marine food webs depend upon. Destabilize these, and the cascading consequences reach far beyond Antarctica. Coral reefs lose their current patterns they depend on, monsoon systems falter, and the equatorial regions that host the majority of Earth's biodiversity face intensified drought or flooding. What is done to the poles is never local, it's planetary. Impact on forests. Atmospheric particle deposition from geoengineering aerosol programs is contributing to the structural decline of forest trees globally. As soils acidify through accumulation of sulfur and nitrogen compounds, critical nutrients are leached out and replaced by phytotoxic heavy metals such as aluminium, stripping trees of the root mass and soil chemistry that they depend on for the structural integrity. Heavy metal particles carried in the wind deposits directly onto bark and into the soil, predisposing trees to damage they can no longer resist. So roots weaken, the bark thins, and the tree's abilities to anchor itself diminishes. What was once a forest capable of withstanding storms becomes a landscape of structurally compromised trees, increasingly unable to hold their ground against strong winds. We are already seeing the evidence of far more trees falling in conditions that would not previously have toppled them. Forests are thinning not from logging but from collapse. The aerosols being injected into the atmosphere are not neutral. They are coming down and the trees are telling us so. Impact on insect populations. Studies of flying insect biomass in Germany conducted in a nature reserve and protected areas away from agricultural land found a decline of more than 75% over 27 years. 15% fewer bird species were recorded in just the 12 years prior to the study's publication. Half of all amphibian species are now at risk of extinction. Amphibians are among our most reliable environmental bioindicators precisely because they absorb toxins directly through their skin. They don't need to ingest contaminated food or water to register the effects of atmospheric pollution. Rachel Carlson described what happened to bird and insect populations when you introduce persistent chemical toxins into an ecosystem. She was writing about DDT in 1962. 60 years later, the same cascading pattern is visible across a much wider range of organisms in protected areas that should be showing resilience, and no government body has commissioned a risk assessment linking atmospheric aerosol programs to these declines. That absence is not an oversight. Risk assessments that found harm would require policy response. No assessment means no obligation to act. The chemicals identified in stratospheric aerosol injection programs include aluminium, barium, strontium, sulfur dioxide, titanium dioxide, and calcium carbonate, among others. Sulfur dioxide in its gaseous state is classified by the EPA as a potent protoplasmic poison, one of the most effective insecticidal compounds known, and is acknowledged on the EPA's own website to damage human respiratory system, with particular severity in children, the elderly, and those with asthma. It causes necrosis in plant tissues and leaches nutrients from soils. The acid precipitation it produces is chemically incompatible with coral reef survival, and yet its injection into the atmosphere has been proposed in peer-reviewed literature as a method of protecting coral reefs. Aluminium nanoparticles accumulate in soils, water, crops, and precipitation. Testing in the United States has found aluminium concentrations in rainwater at 3,450 parts per billion. Aluminium at sufficient concentrations inhibits seed germination. It is a recognized neurotoxin, and rates of Alzheimer's disease are projected to affect 5.5 million Americans by 2040, with no agreed scientific explanation for the scale of increase. Soil and precipitation samples taken by independent researchers globally include the work documented by Dane Wigington at Geoengineering Watch, have consistently found aluminium, strontium, barium, arsenic, and mercury in concentrations inconsistent with natural background levels. The global gap and what it protects. CIEL's an analysis of human rights implications draws on the Human Rights Council's own advisory findings. Geoengineering technologies, if deployed at scale, could violate the rights of billions of people. The populations at greatest risks are indigenous communities, rural peasant farmers, fisher folk, and communities in the global south who depend directly on natural ecosystems for food, water, and cultural survival. These are also the populations with the least power to resist experimentation conducted unilaterally by wealthy nations or private actors. CIEL uses the term sacrifice zones, areas where the most vulnerable populations absorbs the environmental damage, while fossil fuel industries in the global north continue operating undisturbed. That framing is precise and should be used widely. Research and development in solar geoengineering is overwhelmingly concentrated among a small group of actors from the United States and Europe. The cultural bias this produces is not incidental. Indigenous cosmovision, the understanding of relationships between human communities and the natural world that has sustained biodiversity for millennia, is systematically excluded from risk frameworks. The people with the most sustained observational knowledge of nature and specific ecosystems are not at the table, and they need to be. Oversights of a 2023 Congress report. Haskett, J.D., May 2023, Solar Geoengineering and Climate Change Congressional Research Report, Report R47551. The United States government's own research arm confirms a government vacuum in plain terms. May 2023 Congressional Research Report on Solar Geoengineering, the category that includes stratospheric aerosol injection, marine cloud brightening, and cirrus cloud thinning, states outright that no large-scale outdoor experiment in this category had been conducted as of that date, and that most of what policymakers know comes from theoretical modeling rather than field data. This is in itself revealing. An industry capable of attracting billions in private investment and projected to $133.2 billion by 2033 by Congress's own admissions, still operating on models rather than evidence. The same report confirms that there is no intentional agreement exclusively governing solar geoengineering research or deployment. The Convention on Biological Diversity and the London Protocol touch on it, but neither was built for that purpose, and neither closes the gap. Congress went further. In 2022, it directed federal agencies to form an interagency working group tasked with creating a governance framework for publicly funded solar geoengineering research. By the time the CRS report was published the following year, that working group did not appear on the government's own list of active interagency bodies. This oversight mechanism Congress mandated was never built. This is not a fringe claim. It is the conclusion of the Library of Congress's non-partisan research service. The Coalition of International Scientists reached a parallel conclusion in January 2022, calling for a formal non-use agreement on solar geoengineering and warning that existing governance structures, institutional and informal alike, are not equipped to control equitably. When the research arm of the United States Congress and an international scientific coalition arrive at the same conclusion from different directions, the government gaps stop being a matter of interpretation. What CIEL is calling for. The report's recommendations are direct, and states should enforce and expand the existing moratorium on geoengineering under the Convention on Biological Diversity, support strict regulatory controls under the London Convention, ban all outdoor geoengineering experiments in line with the precautionary principle as set out in the Rio Declaration, withdraw public funding and refuse patent or permits for geoengineering technologies, exclude geoengineering from carbon markets and offset programs entirely, prioritize ecosystem restoration and the protection of high biodiversity areas. The broader recommendation stated plainly is that the global community should stop treating speculative atmospheric intervention as a serious climate policy and concentrate instead on what actually addresses the problem: rapid, equitable, financed elimination of fossil fuel dependence. Why this report matters for Ecocide. When I first wrote about geoengineering and the silent ecocide in 2015, there was almost no publicly available official data, and Polly Higgins, the British lawyer responsible for making Ecocide international law, was still alive, working to make Ecocide law a reality. Most of what existed in geoengineering was buried in military research literature archives, which are very difficult to access online. Practice was covert in the sense that the scale and nature of operations was not disclosed to the public, even as trial patterns were visible to anyone who looks up, and chemical signatures were showing up in independent soil and water tests globally. Between then and now, the framing has shifted. Mainstream outlets are now publishing articles describing geoengineering trials as if they are new and experimental, without acknowledging the outdoor trials that have been running continuously since the 1970s. The admission, when it came, was framed as scientific caution and responsible innovation. It was neither. It's been an open experiment on the human race and planet that has bypassed environmental risk assessments and has detrimentally impacted loss of species populations globally, is affecting ecosystem health on terrestrial and marine ecosystems and reducing biodiversity and species biota. What CIEL has done is produced a detailed report that cannot be quietly sidelined. It is in the public domain, produced by an internationally recognized legal and environmental organization. The conclusions align with what independent research has been documenting for decades. Geoengineering does nothing to resolve climate change or reduce carbon dioxide. The call to action is to stop any further experiments as we see signs of irreversible damage and ecosystem collapse. Having CIEL's findings available publicly represents meaningful progress towards accountability. The call to cease all geoengineering activity is no longer fringe. It is the position of a serious international institution backed by the findings of the United Nations Human Rights Council, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and a substantial body of epidemiological research. The experiment was never authorized with public consent. Environmental impact assessments are ongoing environmental risk assessments. Geoengineering does not exist in isolation. It sits inside a larger system that connects telecommunications, satellite systems, defense, Department of Defense, private capital, bioweapons research, gain of function programs, and the industrial and military complex. The same financial networks that profit from atmospheric modification, profit from the pharmaceutical response to the disease that the atmospheric toxicity helps produce. This is not speculation about motive, it is a description of the structural incentives at work. Kevin Anderson, Deputy Director of the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research, said it plainly in a media interview. It is appropriate that we spend money on solar and geoengineering research, but we also have to aim for 2 degrees centigrade with climate mitigation and act as though geoengineering doesn't work, because it probably won't. That is a scientist publicly admitting that an experiment affecting all life on Earth is proceeding without confidence in its outcome, without environmental assessments, and without a mandate from the people it affects. The Stop Ecocide piece, Who Controls the Weather by Anna Faye Maddrick, and the CIEL briefing are taken together the most coherent institutional cases against geoengineering to appear in the public domain. That is a big step, yet when you read them side by side, you notice they are solving the same problem from opposite ends without quite meeting each other. CIEL has the science, the ecological data, the human rights framework, and the institutional credibility to make geoengineering's harm impossible to quietly dismiss, especially with 157 scientific research papers in references at the back. What it lacks is a mechanism for accountability, a legal instrument with teeth that can be applied to individuals and entities, not just states. Stop Ecocide has exactly that mechanism. Environmental ecocide law, if adopted as a 5th international crime under the Rome Statute, would do what no existing environmental treaty has managed: place personal criminal liability on the people in position of power who authorize or profit from severe and widespread environmental damage. Not liable in theory, liability that follows individuals, executives, ministers, and funders, regardless of which jurisdiction they operate from or which philanthropic vehicle their money moves through. Only the CIEL document fully confronts the temporal problem, which is if the legal standards for ecocide acts committed with knowledge of the substantial likelihood of severe, widespread, or long-term environmental damage and atmospheric experimentation has been running since the early 1970s, documented, funded, and expanded over 5 decades by oligarchs and entities who have operated these experiments as if they are above the law. Then accountability cannot begin only when ecocide law passes. The historic record needs to sit inside the legal framework, not outside it as a background context. This is where the collaboration matters. CIEL's evidence-based is precisely what Stop Ecocide's legal framework needs to establish the scale and duration of harm. Stop Ecocide's legal architecture is precisely what gives CIEL's recommendation somewhere to land in law and regulations beyond policy matters that states can ignore. I wrote to both organisations several years ago to attempt to communicate directly on these issues. I didn't hear back from either. I'm raising it again here publicly because the window for incremental institutional caution is closing. The populations already living in CIEL's sacrifice zones, indigenous communities, subsistence farmers, fisherfolk across the global south are not waiting for 2 well-resourced organisations in the global north to find the right moment to share a conference table. The ecosystems that those communities depend on are not waiting either. The ask is straightforward, that CIEL and Stop Ecocide begin collaboration and working from shared ground. That CIEL's documentation of geoengineering historical and ongoing harms form the evidence-free foundation for ecocide prosecutions, that Stop Ecocide's legal framework explicitly names atmospheric modification alongside the other categories of severe environmental damage it seeks to criminalize, and that Stop Ecocide acknowledges plainly that what they are describing did not begin recently. The science is there and the evidence is there. The legal framework is almost complete, thanks to the legacy Polly Higgins left and the hard work of all her team that continued her work in the years after her death to make corporations and individuals accountable for ecocide as a punishable crime. The evidence of harm stretches back 50 years, perhaps more. What's needed is not more parallel work in separate lines, it's the same destination pursued together. The next step is collective. Legal challenges, crowdfunding, litigation against those accountable, and coordinated pressure to close down both the atmospheric programs and the bioweapons infrastructures connected to them. The damage already done to species, soil, water, air, trees, forests, oceans, plants, animals, ecosystems, and humans may be difficult or impossible to reverse. That makes stopping what is ongoing the most urgent priority. That needs to happen now.